Welcome to our deep dive into the American home front
Yeah.
during World War II.
Right.
We're going way beyond the battlefields this time
Mm-hmm.
and looking at how this global conflict
Right.
completely reshaped life within the U.S.
Interesting.
And we're going to be using an episode
Okay.
from the American History Tellers podcast as our guide today.
Cool.
Get ready to uncover some surprising stories,
Okay.
like how wartime labor strikes and racial tensions
Mm-hmm.
really challenge this idea of national unity,
Yeah.
and how the iconic Rosie the Riveter
Right.
became a symbol of female empowerment.
It is fascinating to think about how the war,
Yeah.
it wasn't just fought overseas,
Wow.
but it also sparked these
Yeah.
massive social and economic shifts
Yeah.
right here at home.
Yeah.
It's almost like the entire nation was
Yes.
thrust onto a different course.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And one of the biggest challenges, I think, was figuring out how to mobilize the workforce. When millions of men were shipped off to fight,
Yeah.
you can't build tanks and planes without workers.
You can't.
So what did America do?
Well, they turned to Paul McNutt
Oh,
and the War Manpower Commission
okay.
to solve this labor shortage.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you might think that with
Yeah.
so many jobs suddenly available,
Right.
women would have been welcomed into the workforce
Wow.
with open arms. But that wasn't the case,
Oh, wait.
actually.
Yeah.
A lot of people clung to the idea
Okay.
that a woman's place was in the home, not on the factory floor.
It sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
Trying to ramp up production
Mhm.
while simultaneously sidelining a huge portion
Right.
of the potential workforce.
Exactly.
Wow.
In fact, McNutt himself initially believed
Okay.
that recruiting mothers would be a tough sell,
Mm-hmm.
reflecting the prevailing social norms of the time.
Oh, wow.
But thankfully,
Yeah.
someone with a powerful voice stepped up
Okay.
to champion women in the workforce.
Eleanor Roosevelt.
Eleanor Roosevelt.
Of course.
She was known for her outspoken advocacy
Yeah.
on social issues.
That's right.
How did she manage to shift the conversation?
Well, as First Lady,
Right.
she had a unique platform.
Yeah.
And she wasn't afraid to use it.
Mm-hmm.
She publicly challenged the double standard,
Okay.
arguing that women should be registered for war work,
Yeah.
just like men were for the draft.
Right.
Her influence was instrumental
Mm.
in changing perceptions
Okay.
and opening up opportunities for women
Wow.
on a massive scale.
And this is where Rosie the Riveter enters the picture, right?
That's right.
But she wasn't just a pretty face on a poster.
Right.
How did this campaign actually convince women to join the workforce?
Well, the Rosie campaign was incredibly effective
Okay.
because it went beyond simply asking women to work.
Mhm.
It cleverly tapped into both patriotic duty
Okay.
and the desire for independence.
Mm-hmm.
The image of Rosie, strong and determined,
Right.
with her sleeve rolled up
Yeah.
and tools in hand,
Mm-hmm.
really resonated deeply with women.
Yeah.
It presented them not just as workers,
Right.
but as vital contributors to the war effort.
And they did contribute?
Yeah.
The podcast mentions the story of women working on a Lockheed airplane,
Right.
determined to prove themselves
Yeah.
in this male-dominated field.
Right.
But it also hints at the sexism they faced.
Mm-hmm.
Were these new opportunities
Yeah.
really leading to equality for women?
Well, it's a complicated picture.
Yeah.
On one hand,
Yep.
women were proving themselves capable in roles previously deemed men's work.
Right.
Their contributions to wartime production
Yeah.
were undeniable.
Yeah.
But on the other hand,
Okay.
they still faced lower pay, harassment,
Right.
and the underlying assumption that they'd simply quit
Wow.
after the war.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that wartime needs could challenge social norms.
Yeah. But real equality was still a long way off.
It's a bittersweet victory then.
Yeah.
A step forward, but with a long way to go.
Right.
Now, shifting gears a bit,
Okay.
let's talk about another group
Mm-hmm.
that faced immense challenges on the home front,
Yeah.
African Americans.
Right.
The podcast paints a picture
Yeah.
of rampant pre-war discrimination,
Yes.
with black workers facing double the unemployment rate
Yeah.
of white Americans.
Yeah.
How did the war impact this already dire situation?
That's a crucial question because for many Black Americans, the fight for democracy abroad was inextricably linked to
Yeah.
the fight for equality at home.
Right.
Enter A. Philip Randolph,
Okay.
a civil rights leader who refused to let the government
Yeah.
ignore the issue of racial discrimination
Okay.
in war industries.
The podcast mentions his planned march on Washington.
Yeah.
Was he really willing to stage
Right.
A massive protest in the middle of a war.
Yeah.
What was he hoping to achieve?
Well, Randolph knew that a march on Washington with thousands of black protesters
Yeah.
demanding equal employment opportunities
Right.
would put immense pressure
Yeah.
on President Roosevelt.
Yeah.
It was a calculated risk,
Oh, okay.
but a powerful one.
Yeah.
He was essentially saying,
Yeah.
you can't fight for freedom overseas
Right.
while denying it to your own citizens.
That's incredibly bold.
Yeah.
Did Roosevelt give in to his demands?
Well, Roosevelt was caught in a difficult position. He
Mhm.
couldn't ignore the issue of racial discrimination,
Right.
but he also feared that a massive protest
Mhm.
would disrupt war mobilization efforts
Right.
and potentially lead to violence.
Yeah.
So he negotiated with Randolph,
Oh.
ultimately issuing Executive Order 8802.
Okay, so Executive Order 8802 banned discrimination
Yeah,
in war industries.
that's right.
Sounds like a victory.
It was.
But did it actually work?
It was a significant step, but not a complete solution.
Okay.
Order established the Fair Employment Practices Commission
Right.
to investigate complaints,
Okay.
but its powers were limited.
Mhm.
Progress was often slow and uneven.
Okay.
Plus, it only addressed discrimination in war industries,
Right.
not the broader societal issue
Mhm.
of racial inequality.
So a partial victory then.
Yeah,
But this ties into the Double V campaign, right?
exactly.
The idea of fighting for victory abroad
Yeah.
and victory at home against discrimination.
That's right.
Powerful. The Double V campaign
Yeah.
perfectly captured the complex reality
Mhm.
for Black Americans during the war.
Right.
They were fighting for their country
Yeah.
while simultaneously battling for their own rights and equality.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that the idea of national unity
Okay.
can be complicated,
Right.
and that progress on one front
Yeah.
doesn't automatically translate to progress on another.
Absolutely. And speaking of fighting,
Let's talk about another surprising aspect of the home front,
okay.
labor strikes.
Right.
Now, it's easy to imagine wartime
Mm-hmm.
as a period of unwavering national unity
Right.
where everyone puts aside their differences
Mm-hmm.
for the greater good.
Yeah.
But the reality,
Right.
as always,
Yeah.
is a bit more complicated.
You're right.
Okay.
Initially, there was actually a surge in strikes
Oh, really?
as workers saw an opportunity
Okay.
to leverage their newfound importance.
Mm-hmm.
With millions of men off fighting,
Right.
the demand for labor was high.
Right.
Workers saw this as a chance
Okay.
to fight for better wages and working conditions, especially with the rise in cost of living
Yeah.
due to the war.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So how did the public react to these strikes?
Yeah.
Was there a sense of betrayal
Right.
given that the country was at war?
Well, public reaction was largely negative.
Okay.
People saw these strikes as unpatriotic
Yeah.
and disruptive. To the war effort,
Yeah.
Roosevelt himself was initially frustrated, but he also recognized
Okay.
the legitimacy of some of the workers' demands.
Okay.
So he took a proactive approach.
What did he do?
Well,
Did he just order the workers back to their jobs?
he did something much more strategic.
Okay.
He negotiated a no-strike pledge
Okay.
with labor unions,
Okay.
promising to address their concerns
Mhm.
in exchange for their cooperation.
Okay.
He also established the National War Labor Board
Okay.
to mediate disputes
Mm.
and ensure fair treatment for workers.
Okay.
He understood that a collaborative approach
Yeah.
was more effective than a forceful one.
It sounds like he was trying to find a delicate balance
Right.
between supporting the war effort
Mm-hmm.
and ensuring fair treatment for workers.
That's right.
But the podcast then mentions a specific strike,
Okay.
the coal miners' strike.
Yay.
That threw a wrench into everything.
That's right. The coal miner strike was
Yeah.
a major turning point. Okay.
In the relationship between labor and the government
Mm-hmm.
during the war.
Okay.
Remember, coal was essential for wartime production.
Right.
It fueled factories,
Yeah.
transportation,
Mhm.
even heated homes.
Right.
So when miners walked off the job,
Yeah.
it had a massive impact.
And this strike wasn't just about wages, was it?
No, it was also about dangerous working conditions.
Oh.
Miners were risking their lives every day,
Right.
and they felt that the government wasn't doing enough
Yeah.
to protect them.
Okay.
They were demanding better safety regulations
Mhm.
and fairer compensation for their labor.
Right.
At the heart of this strike was John L. Lewis,
Okay.
the fiery leader of the United Mine Workers,
Okay.
who was a fierce advocate for miners' rights
Mm-hmm.
and not afraid to clash with Roosevelt.
I can only imagine the tension.
Yeah.
So how did this standoff between the government and the miners
Mm-hmm.
play out?
It was a dramatic showdown, to say the least.
Wow.
Roosevelt, under immense pressure.
Yeah. To maintain wartime production,
Right.
invoked emergency powers and sent in troops to seize the mines.
Wow.
Louis Defiant urged the miners to continue their strike.
Oh, wow.
Public outcry reached a fever pitch, with some siding with the miners, while others condemned their actions as unpatriotic.
Wow, it sounds like the very idea of national unity
It was
being tested.
Yeah.
What happened next?
Yeah.
Did the miners eventually go back to work?
Well, the situation reached a boiling point, and Congress intervened by passing the Smith-Connolly Act.
Wasn't that the act that gave the government the power to seize industries
That's right.
during wartime?
Yep.
And essentially ban strikes?
That's the one.
Wow.
It was a major blow to labor unions.
Yeah.
And it's worth noting that even Eleanor Roosevelt, who often sided with labor, publicly opposed the act.
Really?
It's an example of how wartime pressure could lead to decisions that, while perhaps necessary in the short term, had long-lasting consequences for the balance of power between labor and the government.
So we see how the need for national unity during wartime often clashed with the realities of social and economic inequalities.
That's right.
It's clear that the Homefront, far from a monolithic experience.
Right.
And speaking of those inequalities, the podcast then takes us into some of the darker aspects of life on the home front, where wartime pressures exacerbated existing social tensions, particularly around race and ethnicity.
You're right. And one of the most striking examples of this is the mass migration that took place during the war, which, while driven by the need for workers in war industries, had unforeseen and often devastating consequences for many communities.
The podcast mentions that this was the largest internal migration in U.S. history.
Yeah.
Wow. What kinds of problems did this mass movement of people create?
Well, think about it.
Yeah.
Millions of people. Many from rural areas flocked to cities in search of work. In war industries, housing was already scarce. And this influx of people led to overcrowding, strained resources, skyrocketing rents. And as always, these problems disproportionately impacted minority communities who already face discrimination and limited access to housing and resources.
It's like the war, while bringing economic opportunity for some, also exposed and amplified existing social fault lines.
Exactly. And this tension, this pressure cooker of social and economic upheaval sometimes erupted into violence. Podcast highlights a particularly poignant story about a Black family trying to move into the Sojourner Truth Housing Project in Detroit, only to be met with hostility and violence from white residents who didn't want them in their neighborhood.
That's heartbreaking. Were these incidents isolated, or were they part of a larger pattern of racial tension?
Sadly, this was just the tip of the iceberg. The Sojourner Truth incident foreshadowed the devastating Detroit race riot of 1943.
Wow.
One of the deadliest race riots.
A race riot in the middle of World War II. That's not something you typically hear about in history books.
It's a dark chapter that often gets overshadowed by the narrative of wartime unity. The Detroit riot, fueled by prejudice, competition for scarce resources, and rumors of violence, left 34 people dead and hundreds injured.
That's a lot.
It's a stark reminder that the idea of a united home front masked deep racial divisions that could and did
explode into violence.
It's a chilling reminder of how easily fear and prejudice can take root, even in a country supposedly fighting for freedom and democracy. And sadly, as the podcast points out, the Detroit riot wasn't the only example of racially motivated violence during this time.
We also have the Zoot Suit riots in Los Angeles, which, although seemingly sparked by a conflict over fashion, actually revealed the simmering tensions between white servicemen and Mexican-American youth.
Zoot suits, those are the flashy, oversized suits, right?
Yeah.
What made them such a target of hostility?
Well, for Mexican-American youth, the zoot suit was more than just clothing.
Okay.
It was an expression of identity, a rejection of wartime austerity, and a symbol of rebellion against conformity.
Okay.
However, in the context of wartime rationing and conservative social norms, it was perceived by many whites as unpatriotic,
provocative, and even threatening.
It's interesting how something as seemingly innocuous as clothing could become a flashpoint for racial tension.
Right.
What exactly happened during these riots?
Well, fueled by rumors and prejudice, white sailors stationed in Los Angeles began attacking anyone wearing a zoot suit.
Wow.
They would drag young men out of movie theaters, cafes, even their homes, tear their clothes off, and beat them mercilessly.
It sounds brutal.
The violence was brutal and widespread.
Yeah.
And what made it even worse
was
the complicity of the police.
What do you mean by complicity? Did the police just stand by and watch?
In many cases, yes.
Wow.
The police often turned a blind eye to the violence, or even actively participated in it, targeting Mexican-American youth while letting the white sailors go free.
So they weren't protecting them?
No. It was a blatant example of systemic racism.
Right. And a complete perversion of justice.
It's a sobering example of how even during a time of national crisis, when the country is supposedly united against a common enemy, prejudice and discrimination can persist.
It can.
Revealing the deep cracks in the facade of national unity.
That's right. And perhaps the most chilling example of this is the internment of Japanese Americans during the war. This is a difficult topic to discuss.
Okay.
But it's crucial to understand how fear and prejudice, amplified by wartime anxieties, could lead to the suspension of civil liberties and the mass incarceration of innocent people based solely on their ancestry.
I've heard about the Japanese internment camps, but I've never fully understood what led to them. What were the factors that created this climate of fear and suspicion?
Well, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, anti-Japanese sentiment skyrocketed. Understandably. People were scared and angry. But that fear was often misdirected and exploited by those with ulterior motives. The podcast points out the role of economic interests in fueling the push for internment. White farmers and business owners seeing an opportunity to eliminate their Japanese American competitors. Used wartime hysteria to their advantage.
It's appalling how quickly fear can turn into greed and scapegoating.
It is.
So how did the government justify this blatant violation of civil liberties? Did they have any evidence that Japanese Americans posed a threat?
That's the most disturbing part. The government acted based on unfounded fears and racial prejudice. Not any actual evidence of wrongdoing. President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which authorized the military to designate exclusion zones and forcibly relocate anyone deemed a threat
to national security. And while the order didn't specifically name Japanese Americans, that's how it was applied in practice.
It's hard to fathom the injustice of it all.
It is.
Imagine being forced to leave your home, your business, your entire life, simply because of your ancestry. What happened to those who were relocated?
Over 120,000 Japanese Americans. 2/3 of whom were American citizens, were rounded up and sent to internment camps, scattered across the country. These weren't just relocation centers. They were prisons. Surrounded by barbed wire fences and guard towers, where families were crammed into hastily constructed barracks, stripped of their possessions, and subjected to constant surveillance.
That's awful.
It was a blatant violation of their basic human rights.
It's a chilling image.
And
the podcast emphasizes that not a single Japanese American was ever convicted of sabotage or espionage. Their internment was based purely on racial prejudice.
That's right.
Not any actual threat.
Exactly.
It makes you question the very meaning of justice and freedom.
Absolutely. And what makes it even more disturbing is that for decades, the government refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing.
Really?
It wasn't until 1988 that the U.S. formally apologized and offered reparations to Japanese American internees.
It's a stark reminder of how easily fear and prejudice can erode the foundations of a democracy.
That's right.
So as the war dragged on and victory seemed increasingly likely, what was the mood like on the home front? Was there a sense of relief? Or were there new anxieties brewing beneath the surface?
Well, as the war neared its end, a new set of anxieties emerged, particularly around the economic transition from wartime production
to a peacetime economy. Many people remembered the economic turmoil that followed World War I and feared a repeat performance. The debate over reconversion, as it was called, became a central issue.
So what were the competing visions for this reconversion? Who wanted what?
On one side, you had Donald Nelson, the head of the War Production Board, who argued for prioritizing civilian production to ease the transition and prevent mass unemployment. He had the support of labor unions, who feared that returning veterans and the influx of women into the workforce would lead to widespread joblessness.
Makes sense. But who opposed this plan?
Well, the military, unsurprisingly, wanted to maintain wartime production levels until victory was absolutely assured, arguing that any shift in focus could weaken the war effort.
And prolong the conflict. And then you had big businesses who, while perhaps not as explicitly opposed to reconversion, were more concerned with protecting their own interests and maintaining their wartime profits.
It sounds like a clash of priorities and ideologies.
It was.
Who ultimately won this battle over reconversion?
Ultimately, Roosevelt sided with continued war production until Japan's surrender.
Wow.
It was a decision that prioritized national security above all else, reflecting the wartime mindset of sacrificing short-term economic concerns for the sake of winning the war.
So while victory in Europe and the Pacific seemed inevitable, there was still a lot of uncertainty about what the future held for the average American. What were people most worried about?
Jobs were a major concern. Returning veterans, many of whom had been away for years, faced the daunting task of reintegrating into civilian life and competing for jobs in a potentially flooded market. And women who had proven themselves capable and essential in wartime industries
expert speaker.
were anxious about losing their newfound economic independence.
And I can imagine that racial discrimination would further complicated the job market for Black workers and other minorities.
Absolutely. Despite wartime gains in employment, systemic racism continued to create barriers for minorities, limiting their access to opportunities and perpetuating inequalities.
It sounds like the end of the war. While bringing relief and celebration. Also brought a whole new set of challenges and anxieties.
It did.
What happened to the women who had been working in those wartime industries? Did they just go back to being housewives?
Many did, either by choice or because they were forced out of their jobs to make way for returning veterans. Remember, those underlying assumptions about women's roles hadn't magically disappeared.
Of course.
But for many women, the experience of working outside the home had been transformative. They'd tasted economic independence, proven their capabilities, and contributed to the war effort in a meaningful way. And they weren't eager to give that up.
So while the war might be over, the fight for gender equality was far from finished.
Far from finished.
But amidst all this uncertainty and change, the podcast highlights one bright spot. The GI Bill.
Ah, yes, the GI Bill.
Tell me more about that.
Okay.
Why was this piece of legislation so significant?
The GI Bill was a groundbreaking piece of legislation.
Okay.
A testament to the government's recognition of the sacrifices made by those who served in the war.
Right.
It offered a range of benefits designed to help veterans transition back into civilian life and achieve their dreams.
What kinds of benefits did it offer? Was it just about finding jobs?
It was much more than that.
Okay.
The GI Bill provided financial assistance for education,
right,
allowing veterans to pursue higher education or vocational training. It offered low-interest loans for home purchases, fueling a boom in suburban development and home ownership.
Right.
And it provided unemployment benefits and job counseling services to help veterans navigate the post-war job market.
The podcast shares a heartwarming anecdote
Yeah.
about a veteran using the GI Bill to buy a home in a new suburb, capturing the optimism and sense of possibility of that era.
Right.
It sounds like the GI Bill played a major role
It did.
in shaping the American dream
Absolutely.
for an entire generation.
It did, but it's crucial to remember that the benefits of the GI Bill were not distributed equally. And this is where we see, once again, the persistent reality of racial discrimination.
Are you saying that Black veterans were denied access to these benefits?
Not explicitly, but systemic racism embedded in housing policies, educational institutions, and the job market created significant barriers for Black veterans.
So even though it was designed to help, it still had these limitations based on race.
Yeah. For example, redlining practices, which denied loans to people living in predominantly Black neighborhoods.
Wow.
Limited their ability to purchase homes in those booming suburbs.
So while the GI Bill created opportunities for many,
it did.
It also reinforced existing inequalities.
That's right.
It's a reminder that even well-intentioned policies can have unintended consequences, especially when they're implemented within a system that perpetuates discrimination.
You're right. And this brings us to another dark chapter of the Homefront experience. The internment of Japanese Americans during the war, it's a story that challenges the very notions of freedom, justice, and what it means to be an American.
I've heard about the internment camps, but I've never fully grasped the scale of the injustice or the long-lasting trauma it inflicted on Japanese Americans.
Yeah.
Can you tell me more about what happened? And how this could have been allowed to happen in a country that prides itself on democracy and individual liberty?
It's a story that's both shocking and deeply disturbing.
Yeah.
After the attack on Pearl Harbor, anti-Japanese sentiment surged throughout the country. Fear and anger were understandable reactions. But those emotions were often manipulated and exploited to justify the unthinkable, the mass incarceration of innocent people based solely on their ancestry.
It's hard to imagine the fear and uncertainty that Japanese Americans must felt during that time. What led to this decision to round them up and imprison them?
Well, the government, fueled by wartime hysteria and pressure from certain interest groups, claimed that Japanese Americans posed a threat to national security. They argued that their loyalty to the United States was questionable. And that they might engage in espionage or sabotage.
But was there any evidence to support these claims? Were there any actual cases of Japanese Americans committing acts of treason against the United States?
That's the most chilling part of the story. There wasn't a shred of evidence to support these accusations. Not a single Japanese American was ever convicted of espionage or sabotage during the war. It was purely a case of racial prejudice, amplified by wartime anxieties, that led to this gross violation of civil liberties.
It's a stark reminder of how easily fear and prejudice can erode the foundations
of a democracy.
Absolutely.
Even in a country that claims to uphold freedom and justice. What happened to those who were rounded up? Where were they taken?
Well, under Executive Order 9066, signed by President Roosevelt, the military was given the authority to designate certain areas as exclusion zones and forcibly relocate anyone deemed a threat to national security. And while the order didn't specifically name Japanese Americans, that's how it was applied in practice.
So Japanese Americans were essentially targeted based solely on their ethnicity. What were these exclusion zones like?
They weren't relocation centers. They were prisons.
Wow.
Euphemistically called internment camps. Over 120,000 Japanese Americans, 2/3 of whom were American citizens, were rounded up and forced to leave their homes, businesses, and communities.
It's hard to even imagine.
They were stripped of their possessions, their dignity and their freedom.
That's right.
All because of their ancestry.
Yeah.
It's a horrifying thought.
It is.
Can you describe what life was like in these camps?
Imagine this family's crammed into hastily constructed barracks, surrounded by barbed wire fences and guard towers.
Wow.
Subjected to constant surveillance and suspicion.
Right.
They were forced to live in cramped and unsanitary conditions with limited access to privacy, education, or health care.
It sounds awful.
It was a complete upheaval of their lives.
Yeah.
A traumatic experience that left lasting scars on generations of Japanese Americans.
It's hard to fathom the psychological toll that such an experience must have taken on those who were imprisoned. Did they ever receive any kind of apology or compensation for this injustice?
Sadly, it took decades for the U.S. government to acknowledge the wrongfulness of its actions. It wasn't until 1988 that President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which formally apologized for the internment and offered reparations to surviving internists.
It's a step towards justice, but it can never truly erase the pain and suffering inflicted
That's true.
on Japanese Americans during the war.
Right.
It's a stark reminder of the fragility of civil liberties.
It is.
And the importance of vigilance in the face of fear and prejudice.
Absolutely. And it's also a reminder that history is not just a collection of facts and dates, but a living narrative that continues to shape our understanding of the present.
Right.
The experiences of those on the home front during World War II, both the triumphs and the tragedies, offer valuable lessons about resilience, the complexities of national unity, and the ongoing struggle for equality and justice.
It's clear that the war, while ultimately a victory for the United States and its allies, had a profound and lasting impact on American society. It brought about significant social and economic changes, challenged traditional gender roles, and exposed the deep-seated inequalities that continued to plague the nation.
That's true.
And as we move into the final part of our deep dive, I'm curious to explore those lasting legacies and consider what lessons we can draw from this complex and often contradictory era. It's amazing to think about the sheer scale of transformation that took place on the home front during World War II. It wasn't just about rationing in victory gardens. It was about a fundamental shift in the fabric of American society. As we've explored, war brought about new economic opportunities, challenged traditional gender roles, and forced the nation to confront its deep-seated inequalities. So as we wrap up our deep dive, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the lasting legacies of this era. What stands out to you as the most significant changes that emerged from this period?
Well, it's hard to overstate the profound impact World War II had on American society. It's like the entire nation went through a crucible, forging a new identity and setting the stage for the decades that followed. One of the most significant legacies, in my view, is the expansion of the federal government's role in American life. Before the war, the government played a relatively limited role in the economy and social welfare. But the war effort required massive government intervention, from directing industrial production to managing resources to providing social services. And this expansion of government power, while controversial at times, ultimately laid the groundwork for the social programs and economic regulations that would shape the post-war era.
That's a great point. It's easy to forget how much the war changed the relationship between the government and its citizens. It wasn't just about winning the war. It was about creating a more active and engaged role for the government in shaping the lives of its people. But beyond the expansion of government, what other long-lasting changes do you see stemming from this period?
Well, the war also had a profound impact on the American economy. It essentially ended the Great Depression, putting millions of people back to work and sparking a period of unprecedented economic growth. The war effort required massive industrial output,
right,
which led to technological innovations, increased productivity, and the expansion of industries like manufacturing and aerospace and this economic boom, coupled with government programs like the GI Bill, helped create a burgeoning middle class and set the stage for the consumer culture that would come to define post-war America.
It's fascinating to think about how the war, while undeniably destructive, also served as a catalyst for economic growth and innovation. But as we've discussed, these benefits weren't shared equally. The war also exposed, and in some cases exacerbated, the deep inequalities that existed in American society, particularly along racial and gender lines. How do you see those tensions playing out in the post-war era?
That's a crucial question. Because while the war created new opportunities for some, it also highlighted the systemic barriers that continued to limit the prospects for others, for African Americans. Despite their contributions to the war effort, the fight for equality was far from over. The Double V campaign had articulated their desire for victory abroad and victory at home against discrimination. And while there were some gains during the war, such as Executive Order 8802, banning discrimination in war industries, the reality of Jim Crow segregation and racial prejudice persisted in many parts of the country.
It's a reminder that progress is rarely linear. And that even during times of national unity, deep-seated inequalities can persist. So the seeds of the civil rights movement were sown during this period as Black Americans continued to push for equal rights and opportunities. What about the impact of the war on women? We talked about how they entered the workforce in record numbers, challenging traditional gender roles. Did those changes stick? Or was there a backlash against women's newfound independence after the war?
It's a complex picture. On one hand, many women were eager to hold on to the economic independence and personal fulfillment they had gained during the war. The experience of working outside the home had expanded their horizons and challenged societal expectations about their capabilities and aspirations. However, there was also a societal push to return to normalcy after the war, which often meant women returning to traditional domestic roles as wives and mothers.
So it was a time of both progress and pushback.
It was.
With women navigating a changing social landscape and fighting for their right to define their own roles in society. And speaking of changing social landscapes, how did the war impact America's position on the global stage?
The war transformed the United States from a relatively isolationist nation to a global superpower.
Wow.
The war effort required the U.S. to project its military and economic might on a global scale. And in doing so, it emerged as a dominant force in the post-war world.
Wow.
The war also led to the creation of international institutions, like the United Nations and the Bretton Woods system, which aimed to promote global cooperation and economic stability. And these institutions, while imperfect, reflected the growing interconnectedness of nations and the need for collective action to address global challenges.
It's incredible to think about how much the world changed.
It is.
In just a few short years. The war not only reshaped the political and economic order, but it also left an indelible mark on the cultural and social fabric of the nation. It fostered a spirit of innovation, a sense of collective purpose, and a recognition of the interconnectedness of the world.
Absolutely.
But it also exposed the fragility of democracy, the persistence of prejudice, and the challenges of building a truly just and equitable society.
You've captured it perfectly. The World War II Homefront was a time of both triumph and tragedy, a period of profound transformation that continues to shape our understanding of the world today.
Absolutely.
It offers valuable lessons about resilience, the complexities of national unity, and the ongoing struggle for equality and justice.
As we conclude this deep dive, I'm struck by the enduring power of stories. The anecdotes shared in the American History Tellers podcast brought these historical events to life, reminding us that history is not just a collection of facts and dates, but a tapestry woven from the experiences of real people.
I agree. And those individual stories, when woven together, create a richer and more nuanced understanding, of the past, helping us connect the dots between personal experiences and larger historical forces.
I'm also left with a sense of awe at the resilience and determination of those who lived through this era. They faced unimaginable challenges, made profound sacrifices, and yet they persevered, leaving behind a legacy that continues to inspire us today.
Absolutely.
So as we reflect on the lessons of the World War II Homefront, I encourage you to consider how these historical events resonate with your own life and the challenges we face today. Where stories from your own family history connect to this era. How do the themes of unity, sacrifice, and the pursuit of equality continue to shape our world?
Those are powerful questions.
They are.
And I think exploring those personal connections to the past can enrich our understanding of the present and inspire us to build a future that honors the sacrifices of those who came before us.
Well, thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
Yeah, it's been fun.
It's been an enlightening journey. And I hope you've come away with a deeper appreciation for the complexities of the World War II Homefront. And its enduring legacy. Until next time, keep exploring. Keep questioning. And keep learning from the past.
Sounds good.